Welcome on this beautiful afternoon, towards the end of Women's History Month. Yeah, we're still in March. It's a real honor and pleasure to be back here. I spent many hours on this stage as an undergraduate many, many years ago. And Pat Neely and I have also were deeply, deeply influenced at Vassar by a remarkable collection of medieval and early modern musicologists who were here during that time. Janet Knapp and Edward Riley particularly, and a wonderful collaborative medieval and Renaissance studies faculty. And I am one of the products of that, and thrilled to be back here. Another reason that this is so interesting to me is that we have, over the course of my professional career, really seen a sort of radical rethinking of how to imagine composers like Vivaldi and music like the music that Vivaldi himself wrote. And that has, as probably many of you won't be surprised to hear, has driven us to think to try to de-center this idea of the great male composer, and to think much more creatively about how music, particularly in the 18th and earlier centuries, was very much a collaborative project. And so we know about Vivaldi himself, we know about his published music, but the way that was created, of course, is still there to be reconstructed and understood more fully. And so what I'd like to talk to you guys about today for about 10 minutes is literally what we are learning now about that process. And I'm going to set the scene. It's 1711. You have to imagine it's in 1711, which is the year that these concertos were first performed, and they were performed in the church of the Ospedale della Pietà, and probably on a Sunday morning. So, who would have been sitting in the audience? Men of all ages, some of whom would have been tourists, because Venice was one of the most important stops of the European tour. It was deemed essential for a gentleman's education throughout most of Europe. There also would have been respectable women. They would have been both Venetian and also tourists, visitors. Some of them would have been wearing decorative masks, actually maybe most, because that was the custom during the winter months of Carnival, when many of these concerts might easily have been produced. Why masks? It was a practice distinctive to Venice, which in 1711 was technically a republic. It was the only European state that was not ruled by a monarch, and it was not dominated by a princely court that set the cultural agenda. Instead, Venice was governed by a hereditary nobility, which led to more decentralized patronage of cultural life, and promoted the free exchange of ideas. This situation broke down social barriers. It was known as a libertine city, a place to indulge the appetites and enjoy licentious behaviors. Sexual adventuring, this was the city of Casanova, after all, gambling, and performances of all kinds were enjoyed in public opera houses and private performance spaces. The church that we're in today, theoretically, was a bit of a hybrid. This led to the intermingling of nobles and commoners, Christians and Jews, men and women, Venetians and foreigners. All this mixing was made possible by the wearing of masks. Masks protected the dignity of noblemen, especially those down on their luck, preserved the aura of modesty that was so important for the reputation of noble women. Masking made possible the promiscuity that Venice was famous for. And music, the concertos we will hear today, for example, was central to the practices of seduction that drove so much of Venetian culture. A concert at the Ospedale della Pietà in 1711 was a sought-after tourist attraction. It would have attracted a sophisticated audience that recognized how innovative and exciting the music was. They thrilled to the virtuoso playing on stringed instruments and to the seductive power of the music itself and the women performing it. The Ospedale grew out of a uniquely Venetian tradition of public charity, supported by the state and supervised by Venetian noblemen. The protection of vulnerable women and girls was thought to be a responsibility of the state, and it was a way to maintain social stability and reinforce Christian values. The noblemen on the Board of Governors of the Ospedale understood that funding these impressive musical activities brought them prestige and power and reinforced Venice's international reputation for innovation in music and theater. And here I'd like to note that since antiquity, women making music have been associated with sirens and their magical, alarming ability to seduce and bewitch their listeners. And this idea, both thrilling and alarming, would have been very much alive in the minds of the men and women in our audience tonight, this afternoon. The Ospedale was not a convent, but their administrative structure borrowed many of the ideas about how to organize and control a disparate community of women. There would have been anywhere from 400 to 800 residents in this Ospedale. They got these ideas from the convents that were so many of them in the city. Like nuns, the women of the Ospedale were isolated from men as much as possible. Like nuns, they were expected to be obedient virgins. And Venetian noblewomen on the Board of Governors were ultimately in charge of the Ospedale, but it's the record of their meetings and deliberations that show the historical evidence and make it clear that they delegated all the day-to-day operations to a complex and highly organized female staff. So let's get back to the concert. Once the crowd was seated, the musicians filed in through a back stair, climbing to the balcony, where they sat behind a metal grill. The building where the concert took place in 1711 is no longer there, but we have a lot of descriptions of how this worked. The women were dressed simply. No ornamentation was allowed, but they weren't hidden. But they also weren't easy to see. The important thing is that they were not on display as women in public usually were. So, in a sense, the iron grill hiding the female performers was the architectural equivalent of the mask worn by people in the audience. We return to themes of seduction here. So what did the performers look like? Venice had a long history of trying to regulate the appearance of women of all social classes, and the performers, called figlie, were no exception. We know from the many reports written by foreign tourists that these prohibitions only whetted the curiosity of visitors to the Ospedale, who were naturally preoccupied with the musician's appearance. Some of these accounts have been included in your program notes. People really wanted to see the women playing and singing, and they were prepared to pay a lot for the privilege, which of course the governors of the Ospedale, in their constant quest for funds, were happy to accommodate. So who were these women? How could you become a figlia di coro? They were all orphans who had been abandoned at the Ospedale as infants, sometimes just a few days old. More than half of these infants, when they were abandoned, died. Many more did not survive childhood. But those who, they had been sent to wet nurses in the country. They came back. If they got to the age of 6, they were given a sort of test to evaluate their musical aptitude, and then if they had a lot of musical aptitude, they would start musical instruction. Their teachers were the older women in the figlia di coro. Eventually, the most accomplished girls were invited to join this core group of musicians who was performing behind the grill at the Ospedale's church. And the ultimate goal for many of these orphans eventually was marriage, which is not the case for a nun. And their musical training gave them a great advantage in the 18th century when navigating the world beyond the Ospedale where they were raised. The 50 or so accomplished musicians who played for the Ospedale were called the figlie di coro, partly because the word figlia in Italian means daughter, and it suggests membership in a family and hence subjection to paternal authority, governors. Historians have long assumed that the figlie were under strict control of the male music masters, that they were meek and cloistered, nun-like figures, prohibited from interacting with their audiences. However, very important research in the administrative records of the Ospedale by Vanessa Tonelli reveals quite a different picture of the musical lives and musical independence of these accomplished women. The goal of her research has been, quote, to restore the voices of the figlie and let us hear them more clearly than we have been able to in the past while hearing music composed by Vivaldi and others. Tonelli's research has revealed a system at the Ospedale that looks a lot like a modern conservatory. Many of the performers were probably in their 20s or 30s, highly experienced and superbly trained, within a system that was largely run by women and supervised by male governors. We know that the governors themselves were musically ambitious and hired top male musicians like Vivaldi to come teach the most promising figlie. But female music teachers were always present to supervise this instruction and coordinate the activities of what we would call a conservatory today. It was a competitive place that regularly produced musical stars and then exploited the stars to attract more donations to the Ospedale. Some of the women were regularly allowed to perform at private events outside the Ospedale, at people's houses, and to invite guests to hear them play. These figlie were highly skilled in techniques of improvised basso continuo realization, Baroque-style ornamentation, and soloistic cadenzas. This kind of improvisation, based on a sophisticated understanding of harmony and counterpoint, was part of any virtuoso performance in this period. Anna Maria della Pietà, who joined the figlie in 1706 and was considered to be probably one of the most famous violinists to have lived in 18th century Europe, an exceptional person. She had been working with Vivaldi for 5 years by the time he wrote the pieces that we will be hearing tonight, this afternoon. She was considered one of the finest violinists, and historians have uncovered the stories also of many other women who had long and satisfying musical careers at the Ospedale as soloists, teachers, and probably as composers, although all of this music has been lost. The Ospedale, as revealed to us by Tonelli's research, was a largely self-governing master-apprentice system, where Vivaldi's impact was temporary, although important, a link in a long chain of male music masters. It was the figlie di coro themselves who sustained the musical instruction and maybe the musical imagination as well. At the Ospedale, even though Vivaldi and the other music masters had ultimate control over what was performed, I think that we need to allow for the possibility that the women performing the music were deeply involved in the product that ultimately was written down and published as Vivaldi himself. Now I'd like to say a few words about Vivaldi himself. His own ambitions extended far beyond the Ospedale della Pietà. As explained in today's notes, Vivaldi's title for the collection of the 12 concertos we will hear, the Estro Armonico, suggests fantastic inventive virtuosity. He was proud of this concerto form that highlighted virtuosic string players, and he was very proud of this music that we will hear, so much so that he wanted to be sure that he reached an international audience. So he chose to have the music published by Roger in Amsterdam. He pioneered a brand new way to print music using engraving, which made it far more legible. And actually tonight, the musicians will be playing from the facsimile edition of the Roger that was originally published in 1711. It was this collection of compositions that eventually brought Vivaldi to the attention of not only an international audience, but the young Johann Sebastian Bach in northern Germany. Bach himself never made it to Italy, or at least to Venice, but he was deeply influenced by the concertos that you'll hear. So back to the concert. In 1711, not many people in the audience had probably ever heard of Vivaldi. He was a young virtuoso violinist, a violin teacher, and an up-and-coming composer. He was a typical Venetian, entrepreneurial, collaborative, ambitious for an international audience, and used to maneuvering in a world without a princely court and without the consequent top-down system of princely patronage. His career straddled sacred and secular, as did the experiences of women musicians who played for him. He was ordained as a priest, but not a priest who could say Mass. He was technically on the staff of the Pietà, the Ospedale della Pietà, for over 40 years, but he traveled a great deal, and his main job in Venice, eventually, was impresario of the Teatro Sant'Angelo, a very secular theater, where he wrote secular operas. So a concert of instrumental music like the one we're here today is uniquely Venetian. The seductive sounds emanating from the balconies of the Ospedale Church on Sunday morning were secular instrumental concertos. They were composed by a man who knew how to navigate the porous boundaries between sacred and secular in a context that was so unique to Venice. No courtly patrons, of course, but lots of wealthy nobles, and I think most importantly, this really musically sophisticated audience who would thrill to innovations. The women performing at the Ospedale had access to uniquely rewarding careers. In fact, no other part of Europe would offer this opportunity to them. They were supposed to lead chaste, almost monastic lives, but they could also achieve fame and money in the public-facing, risk-taking world of musical performance. And my last thing I'd just like to say to all of you, if you have been to Venice, you have probably had the experience of the water in the lagoon, and it sort of moves around slowly and seductively in a way. And I think that Vivaldi's slow movements feel very lagoonish to me, so that's something that you'd like to think about, but we'll do so.